Sometimes the most profound stories unfold 30,000 feet above ground, where strangers become witnesses to extraordinary human courage. In a world where we judge quickly and assume even faster, one flight attendant's decision would expose the dangerous game of appearances versus reality. What happens when someone's deepest pain becomes their greatest strength? When scars that were meant to shame become symbols of survival? This is the story of Sarah Martinez, a woman whose journey through darkness would ultimately illuminate the hearts of everyone around her. Starting with a pilot who understood that sometimes the most important flights aren't about reaching a destination, but about discovering the incredible resilience of the human spirit that travels alongside us. Sarah Martinez adjusted her long sleeves for the 100th time as she approached the boarding gate at Miami International Airport. The cotton fabric felt heavy against her skin in the humid Florida air, but she had learned long ago that comfort was a luxury she couldn't afford when it came to hiding her past. At 28, Sarah had perfected the art of making herself invisible, of blending into crowds, and avoiding the curious stares that inevitably came when people saw too much. The boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, calling first-class passengers to board Flight 447 to Los Angeles. Sarah clutched her boarding pass tighter, still hardly believing her luck. After 3 years of working double shifts at the Miami General Hospital as a trauma nurse, she had finally saved enough for a first-class ticket to visit her sister Emma, who lived in California. Emma had been begging Sarah to come for months, especially after their mother's death 6 months earlier. This trip wasn't just a vacation. It was Sarah's attempt to reconnect with the only family she had left. As Sarah made her way down the jet bridge, she felt a familiar flutter of anxiety in her stomach. Flying had always made her nervous, but it wasn't the thought of being thousands of feet in the air that worried her. It was the confined space, the inability to escape if someone started asking questions she didn't want to answer. She had chosen first class specifically for the extra space and privacy it would provide. The cabin was elegant, with cream-colored leather seats and polished wood accents. Sarah found her seat, 2A, by the window. She settled in quickly, pulling out her worn paperback novel and hoping to lose herself in someone else's story for the next 5 hours. The book was a romance novel, the kind where everything worked out perfectly in the end, a fantasy that felt increasingly distant from her own life. "Excuse me, miss." A sharp voice cut through Sarah's thoughts. She looked up to see a woman in her 50s standing in the aisle, wearing an expensive pantsuit and a disapproving expression. Behind her stood a flight attendant named Jennifer, whose nameplate gleamed under the cabin lights. "Yes," Sarah asked softly, closing her book and placing it in her lap. "I'm Mrs. Catherine Wellington," the woman announced, as if the name should mean something. "And I believe you're in the wrong section. This is first class." She gestured around the cabin with a manicured hand, her diamond rings catching the light. Sarah felt her cheeks flush. "I have a first-class ticket," she replied quietly, holding up her boarding pass. "Seat 2A." Mrs. Wellington leaned closer, her eyes scanning Sarah from head to toe. She took into modest jeans, the simple white sneakers, the long-sleeve cotton shirt that had seen better days. "Are you sure you didn't make a mistake when booking? Economy class is toward the back of the plane." The flight attendant, Jennifer, stepped forward with a plastic smile. "Ma'am, if you could just show me your boarding pass, we can clear this up quickly." Sarah handed over the pass, her hands trembling slightly. She could feel other passengers watching now, their conversations dying down as they turned to observe the commotion. The familiar feeling of being scrutinized washed over her, bringing back memories she had worked hard to bury. Jennifer examined the boarding pass with exaggerated care, her eyebrows raised in apparent surprise. "Well, this does say first class," she admitted reluctantly. "But there seems to have been some kind of error. How did you afford a first-class ticket?" The question came out more accusingly than professionally. "I saved up for it," Sarah answered, her voice barely above a whisper. She could feel her heart racing, the familiar panic starting to build. "I work as a nurse. I've been saving for months. Mrs. Wellington scoffed loudly. A nurse? In first class? That seems unlikely. She turned to address the other passengers as if they were jury members in a trial. Does this seem right to any of you? I mean, look at her clothes, her appearance. This is first class, not a charity case. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She had heard similar comments before in different contexts, but they never got easier to bear. The other passengers were staring openly now, some nodding in agreement with Mrs. Wellington, others looking uncomfortable but saying nothing. "Ma'am," Jennifer said, her voice taking on a firmer tone, "I think there's been a booking error. We're going to have to move you to economy class. I'm sorry for the inconvenience." Sarah's throat tightened. "But I paid for this seat. I have the receipt on my phone if you need to see it." She fumbled for her phone with shaking hands, but Jennifer held up a hand to stop her. "The computer shows there was a processing error with your payment. Sometimes these things happen with certain types of credit cards." The implication was clear, and Sarah felt her face burn with humiliation. "What kind of credit cards?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. Jennifer lowered her voice, but not enough to prevent nearby passengers from hearing. "Well, sometimes when people use those prepaid cards or government assistance cards, the system gets confused." The assumption was devastating. Sarah had worked 60-hour weeks to save for this ticket, had sacrificed meals and social outings, had worn the same clothes for years to afford this one luxury. She had paid with her regular debit card, linked to the checking account where she deposited her hard-earned paychecks. Mrs. Wellington crossed her arms triumphantly. "I knew something was off. Jennifer, please escort her to the appropriate section. Some of us paid good money to sit in first class, and we shouldn't have to deal with this kind of situation." The other passengers were watching like spectators at a sporting event. A man in an expensive suit nodded his approval. "She's right," he said loudly. "If you can't afford to be here properly, you shouldn't be here at all." Sarah felt tears threatening to spill over. The shame was overwhelming, not just because of the accusations about her financial situation, but because of how quickly these strangers had judged her worth as a human being. She started to gather her small carry-on bag, defeated and humiliated. "Please follow me," Jennifer said curtly, already turning toward the back of the plane. As Sarah stood up, her book fell from her lap and hit the floor. When she bent to pick it up, her sleeve rode up slightly, revealing just a glimpse of the scarred skin on her forearm. Mrs. Wellington caught sight of it and gasped audibly. "Good Lord, what is that?" she exclaimed, pointing at Sarah's arm as if she had discovered evidence of crime. Sarah quickly pulled her sleeve down, but it was too late. Several passengers had seen the scars, and she could hear the whispers starting. "Drug addict," someone muttered. "I knew she didn't belong here," another voice added. The assumptions were like knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. Sarah had spent years in recovery, years rebuilding her life from the ground up, years proving to herself that she was more than her darkest moments. But in the eyes of these strangers, she would always be defined by the physical evidence of her past pain. "Ma'am, we really need to get you seated so we can take off," Jennifer said impatiently, gesturing toward the economy section. Sarah looked around the first-class cabin one last time, seeing only judgment and disgust in the faces that stared back at her. She had dreamed of this moment for months, had imagined how good it would feel to treat herself to something nice for once. Instead, she felt smaller and more worthless than she had in years. "Okay," she whispered, shouldering her bag. "I'll move." As she started to walk toward the back of the plane, following Jennifer's brisk pace, Sarah could hear Mrs. Wellington addressing the other passengers behind her. "Well, I'm glad we got that sorted out. You really can't be too careful these days. People will try anything to get something they don't deserve." The words followed Sarah down the aisle like a cloud of poison. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, counting the seat numbers as they passed. 10A, 15C, 20B. Each number took her further away from the dream she had worked so hard to afford, further away from the small victory she had hoped to claim for herself. When they reached the economy section, Jennifer stopped at row 28, near the back of the plane. "Here we go," she said, her voice artificially cheerful. 28F, middle seat. Hope you're comfortable. Sarah looked at the cramped row, squeezed between a large man who was already snoring and a woman with 3 young children who were bouncing in their seats. The contrast to the spacious first-class cabin was stark. But what hurt most wasn't the smaller seat or the lack of legroom. It was the realization that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she had overcome, she would always be judged by her appearance, by the visible reminders of her past struggles. As Sarah settled into her assigned seat, she caught her reflection in the small airplane window. She saw what the other passengers had seen, a young woman in modest clothes, with tired eyes and sleeves pulled down to hide secrets. She understood why they had made their assumptions. In a world where success was measured by external markers, she had learned to make herself invisible to avoid exactly this kind of scrutiny. The plane began a taxi toward the runway, and Sarah closed her eyes, tried to push away the humiliation of the past 20 minutes. She thought about Emma, waiting for her in Los Angeles, and tried to focus on that reunion instead of the judgment she had just endured. But the voices from first class seemed to echo in her mind, reminding her that some things never changed, no matter how far you traveled or how high you climbed. As the aircraft lifted off from Miami, climbing into the afternoon sky, Sarah Martinez sat in seat 28F and wondered if she would ever truly escape the prison of other people's assumptions. She had no idea that her story was far from over, and that sometimes the most unexpected allies could be found in the most unlikely places. Captain David Torres had been flying commercial aircraft for 22 years, and in that time, he had seen almost everything. He had handled emergency landings, difficult passengers, and countless moments of human drama that played out 30,000 feet above the earth. But as he finished his pre-flight checks and prepared for takeoff, something about the commotion he had witnessed in first class bothered him more than usual. From the cockpit doorway, David had caught glimpses of the incident with the young woman who had been moved from first class to economy. He had seen Mrs. Wellington's theatrical performance and Jennifer's unprofessional handling of the situation. As a captain, David prided himself on running an aircraft where all passengers were treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their ticket class or background. During the first hour of the flight, as they cruised over the Gulf of Mexico, David found himself thinking about the young woman. Something in her posture, in the way she had quietly accepted the humiliation, reminded him of someone he knew very well, his own daughter, Maria, who had struggled with addiction in her early 20s. Maria had been clean for 5 years now, working as a social worker and helping other people overcome their own demons. But David remembered the years when she had been trapped in the cycle of addiction, when the physical and emotional scars had made her feel like she didn't deserve basic human decency. He remembered the judgment in people's eyes, the way they looked at Maria as if she were something broken and dangerous rather than someone fighting the hardest battle of her life. The memory made David's chest tighten with familiar anger. He had watched his daughter transform herself from a broken young woman into someone strong and compassionate, someone who used her experience to help others heal. But he also remembered how long it had taken her to believe she deserved respect and kindness, how the judgment of strangers had almost destroyed her sense of self-worth entirely. 2 hours into the flight, David decided to take his routine walk through the cabin. This was something he did on longer flights, greeting passengers and checking on the overall atmosphere of the aircraft. He started in first class, where Mrs. Wellington was loudly complaining to anyone who would listen about the security issues with airline booking systems. I mean, honestly, she was saying to the man in the expensive suit, if they can't properly screen passengers, what else are they failing to check? That woman could have been anyone. Did you see those marks on her arms? Clearly a drug user. I have grandchildren, and I don't feel safe knowing people like that can just buy their way into first class. David felt his jaw clench. He had heard enough. Without saying anything to the first-class passengers, he made his way toward the back of the plane, scanning the rows until he found the young woman from the earlier incident. Sarah was sitting in 28F, staring out the small window at the clouds below. She had been trying to read her book, but the words kept blurring together as she replayed the humiliation from earlier. The passenger next to her was snoring loudly, and the children in the row were getting increasingly restless, but she barely noticed. She was lost in her own thoughts, questioning whether she had made a mistake in taking this trip at all. "Excuse me, miss?" David's voice was gentle but authoritative. Sarah looked up to see a man in a captain's uniform standing in the aisle beside her seat. He was probably in his 50s, with kind eyes and graying hair, and his presence commanded immediate respect from the other passengers around them. "Yes, Captain." Sarah's voice was barely audible above the airplane noise. "I'm Captain Torres. I was wondering if I could have a word with you privately. Would you mind stepping into the galley area for a moment?" Sarah's heart began racing again. She assumed she was in trouble for something, that perhaps her presence on the aircraft was causing more problems than she realized. "Am I being removed from the flight?" she asked, her voice shaking. David's expression softened immediately. "Oh no, nothing like that. I just wanted to check on you after what happened during boarding. I saw some of the incident from the cockpit, and I wanted to make sure you were okay." Surprised by his concern, Sarah followed Captain Torres to the small galley area at the back of the plane, where they could speak more privately. The flight attendants working in the area stepped aside respectfully, giving them space. "I want to apologize for how you were treated earlier," David began, his voice sincere. "That was unprofessional and completely unacceptable. You had every right to sit in the seat you paid for." Sarah was stunned. In all the scenarios she had imagined, having the captain of the aircraft apologize to her personally was not one of them. "It's okay," she said automatically, though they both knew it wasn't. "No, it's not okay," David replied firmly. "I've been flying for over 20 years, and I've never seen a passenger treated that way based solely on appearances and assumptions. You paid for a first-class seat, and you should have been allowed to sit in it with the same respect afforded to any other passenger." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes again, but this time they were tears of relief rather than humiliation. For the first time all day, someone was treating her like a human being deserving of basic dignity. "I understand if you don't want to talk about it," David continued gently, "but I noticed some scarring on your arm when you were gathering your things. I hope you don't mind me asking, but have you been through recovery?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had spent so much energy hiding her scars, hiding her past, that being asked about it directly was both terrifying and somehow liberating. She looked at Captain Torres carefully, searching his face for signs of judgment or disgust, but found only compassion and understanding. "Yes," she whispered. "I've been clean for 4 years." David nodded slowly. "My daughter Maria went through something similar. She's been clean for 5 years now, and she's one of the strongest people I know. But I remember how hard it was for her when people made assumptions based on her scars." The connection hit Sarah like a physical force. Here was someone who understood, someone who had seen the struggle from the perspective of someone who loved a person in recovery. She felt something inside her chest loosen, a tension she hadn't even realized she was carrying. "The thing is," David continued, "Maria taught me that those scars aren't signs of weakness. They're proof of survival. They're evidence that you fought a battle and won. And anyone who judges you based on them doesn't understand the strength it takes to overcome addiction." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Most people don't see it that way. Most people don't know what they're looking at," David replied. "They see scars and make assumptions instead of recognizing courage when it's right in front of them." He paused for a moment, then asked, "What do you do for work?" "I'm a trauma nurse at Miami General Hospital," Sarah answered, straightening her shoulders slightly with pride. David's eyebrows raised in genuine admiration. "A trauma nurse? That's incredible. You're literally saving lives every day." "It's what I'm meant to do," Sarah said quietly. "After what I went through, after the people who helped me get clean, I knew I wanted to help people who were having the worst days of their lives. I wanted to be the person for them that my recovery sponsors were for me." David smiled broadly. "That's exactly what Maria does too. She's a social worker now, specializing in addiction counseling." She says her experience gives her credibility with her clients that someone who hasn't been through it could never have. The conversation was interrupted by Jennifer, who appeared at David's shoulder looking nervous and slightly irritated. "Captain Torres? Is everything all right back here?" David turned to face the flight attendant, his expression becoming stern and professional. "Actually, Jennifer, I wanted to discuss the situation from earlier with you. Can you explain to me why this passenger was moved from her assigned first-class seat?" Jennifer shifted uncomfortably. "Well, there was a question about her ticket, and Mrs. Wellington was concerned about—" "Mrs. Wellington isn't crew," David interrupted. "She doesn't make decisions about seating arrangements. What was the actual problem with the passenger's ticket?" Jennifer's face flushed. "Well, it seemed like there might have been a payment processing error, and given her appearance—" "Her appearance?" David's voice took on a dangerous edge. "Are you telling me you moved a paying passenger based on how she looked?" "No, sir, it's just that, Jennifer, this passenger has a valid first-class ticket that was purchased with legitimate funds. She's a medical professional who works at a major hospital. The fact that you made assumptions about her based on her clothing or anything else is completely unacceptable." Sarah watched the exchange with growing amazement. She had never had anyone defend her so forcefully, especially someone in a position of authority. Jennifer looked like she wanted to disappear into the airplane floor. "I want you to go to first class right now," David continued, "and prepare seat 2A for this passenger. She'll be moving back to the seat she paid for immediately." "But, Captain," Jennifer protested, "Mrs. Wellington specifically requested—" "Mrs. Wellington is a passenger, not airline personnel," David cut her off. "She doesn't get to decide where other passengers sit based on her personal prejudices. If she has a problem with airline policy, she can file a complaint when we land." Sarah felt her knees go weak. "Captain Torres, you don't have to do this. I don't want to cause more trouble." David turned back to her, his expression gentle again. "You're not causing trouble. You're exercising your right to receive the service you paid for. And, more than that, you deserve to be treated with respect regardless of where you're sitting on this airplane." He looked directly into Sarah's eyes. "I want you to know something. What you've overcome, what you're doing with your life now, that's heroic. You're a hero, even if nobody else on this plane recognizes it. My daughter taught me that recovery isn't just about stopping drug use. It's about rebuilding your entire life, learning to believe you're worth saving, and then using that experience to help other people. That's exactly what you've done." Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks again, but for the first time in years, they were tears of gratitude and relief. Someone saw her for who she really was, not just the surface story her scars seemed to tell. "Now," David said with a smile, "let's get you back to your proper seat. And, Jennifer, I'll be filing a report about this incident when we land. This kind of discrimination is not acceptable on any aircraft I'm responsible for." As they walked back toward first class, Sarah felt like she was in a dream. The passengers in economy looked up curiously as the captain personally escorted her forward through the cabin. When they reached the first-class section, Mrs. Wellington's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, outrage, and, finally, a pale realization that she had misjudged the situation entirely. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Torres announced to the first-class cabin, "I want to introduce you to Sarah Martinez. Ms. Martinez is a trauma nurse who saves lives every day at Miami General Hospital. She purchased her first-class ticket legitimately and will be taking her assigned seat. I expect her to be treated with the same courtesy and respect we show all our passengers." The silence in first class was deafening. Mrs. Wellington opened her mouth as if to protest, then seemed to think better of it. The man in the expensive suit suddenly found his magazine very interesting. Other passengers looked embarrassed, realizing they had participated in judging someone based on incomplete information. Sarah settled back into seat 2A, the same seat she had been forced to abandon hours earlier. But everything was different now. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't ashamed. Captain Torres had given her something she hadn't experienced in years, the feeling that she belonged exactly where she was. As Captain Torres prepared to return to the cockpit, he leaned down and spoke quietly to Sarah. "My daughter would be proud to know you," he said. "And I hope you know that your story isn't defined by your worst moments. It's defined by how you chose to rebuild and help others." Sarah nodded, unable to speak around the emotion in her throat. As the captain walked away, she realized that this flight had become something entirely different from what she had expected. It had become a reminder that sometimes, when you least expect it, someone sees your true worth and isn't afraid to defend it. The remainder of the flight to Los Angeles transformed into something Sarah had never experienced before. As she settled back into seat 2A, she noticed the other first-class passengers stealing glances at her, but the nature of those glances had completely changed. Where before there had been judgment and suspicion, now there was curiosity mixed with what appeared to be genuine respect. About an hour after Captain Torres had returned to the cockpit, something unexpected happened. The man in the expensive suit, who had earlier nodded in agreement when Mrs. Wellington demanded Sarah's removal, approached her seat hesitantly. "Excuse me," he said quietly, his voice lacking the confidence it had held earlier. "I'm Robert Chen. I wanted to apologize for my behavior during the boarding incident. I made assumptions I had no right to make." Sarah looked up from her book, surprised by the genuine remorse in his voice. "It's okay," she replied, though she could see in his eyes that he knew it wasn't really okay. Robert shifted uncomfortably. "No, it's not. The thing is, my brother struggled with addiction for years. I should have known better than to judge someone based on anything really. My brother has been clean for 2 years now, and he's completely turned his life around. If someone had judged him the way I judged you today, it would have devastated him." Sarah could see the pain in Robert's face as he spoke about his brother. It occurred to her that everyone carried hidden stories, hidden struggles, and that judgment often came from fear rather than malice. "Recovery is hard," Sarah said gently. "Your brother is lucky to have family who supports him." "Actually," Robert continued, "I wanted to ask if you might be willing to share some insight. I'm flying to Los Angeles to see him, and I've been struggling with how to talk to him about his scars. He's still very self-conscious about them, and I don't want to say the wrong thing." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest. This conversation had shifted from an apology to a genuine request for help, something she encountered often in her work as a nurse, but rarely in personal situations. "The most important thing," Sarah said thoughtfully, "is not to ignore them or pretend they don't exist, but also not to make them the focus of every interaction. When someone is ready to talk about their story, they'll share it. But what really matters is showing them that you see them as a whole person, not just their past struggles." Robert nodded earnestly, pulling out his phone. "Would it be okay if I took some notes? I really want to get this right." For the next 30 minutes, Sarah found herself in an unexpected role as advisor and educator. Robert asked thoughtful questions about how to support someone in recovery, how to recognize signs of struggle, and how to have honest conversations about addiction without making the person feel like they were being interrogated. Their conversation attracted the attention of other passengers. A woman across the aisle, who had remained silent during the earlier confrontation, leaned over and introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychiatrist who specialized in addiction medicine. "I couldn't help but overhear," Dr. Williams said, "and I have to say, your perspective is incredibly valuable. Too often, we medical professionals forget that the lived experience of recovery provides insights that all our training can't match." Soon, several passengers were engaged in a wide-ranging discussion about addiction, recovery, mental health, and the importance of not judging people based on appearances. Sarah found herself sharing parts of her story she had never discussed with strangers before, but the atmosphere felt safe and respectful in a way she had never experienced. She talked about the night she had overdosed and nearly died, about waking up in the same hospital where she now worked and deciding that she either wanted to die or completely change her life. She described the grueling process of detox, the months of therapy, the slow rebuilding of trust with her family, and eventually her decision to become a nurse. The scars aren't just from drug use, Sarah explained, rolling up her sleeve for the first time in years to show the marks on her arms. Some of them are from medical procedures that saved my life. Some are from moments when I hurt myself because I didn't know how else to deal with the pain. But now, when I see them, I think about how far I've come. Mrs. Wellington, who had been conspicuously quiet since Captain Torres's announcement, finally spoke up. Her voice was softer than before, almost tentative. "I owe you an enormous apology," she said, looking directly at Sarah. "I was completely out of line, and I'm ashamed of my behavior." Sarah studied Mrs. Wellington's face, seeing genuine regret there. "Thank you for saying that," Mrs. Wellington continued, her voice growing stronger. "The truth is, I was angry about something else entirely. My son is struggling with substance abuse, and I've been so focused on being disappointed in him that I forgot to see his suffering. When I saw you, I think I projected all my frustration onto you. That was wrong and unfair." The admission hung in the air for a moment, and Sarah felt her heart open with compassion for this woman she had seen as her tormentor just hours earlier. "Addiction is a disease," Sarah said gently. "Your son didn't choose to become addicted any more than someone chooses to get cancer. But there is hope. Recovery is possible, and having family support makes an enormous difference." Mrs. Wellington's eyes filled with tears. "How do I help him when I'm so angry and scared all the time?" Sarah thought about her own family, about her sister Emma, who had stood by her through the worst periods of her addiction, and about the ways love could both heal and complicate the recovery process. "The anger and fear are normal," Sarah explained. "But your son needs to know that you see him as more than his addiction. He needs to know that you believe he's capable of recovery, even when he doesn't believe it himself." For the next hour, the first-class cabin became an unlikely support group. Mrs. Wellington shared her struggles with loving an addicted child. Robert talked about the guilt he felt for not understanding his brother's addiction sooner. Dr. Williams offered professional insights while acknowledging the limitations of clinical knowledge without lived experience. Jennifer, the flight attendant who had originally moved Sarah from first class, approached during the conversation with obvious nervousness. "Ms. Martinez," she began hesitantly, "I wanted to apologize personally for my behavior earlier. I made assumptions based on stereotypes, and that was completely unprofessional. I also wanted you to know that listening to this conversation has been eye-opening for me." Sarah could see that Jennifer's apology was sincere. "Thank you. I appreciate that. I have a cousin who's been struggling with addiction," Jennifer continued. "I've been avoiding him because I didn't know what to say or do. But hearing you talk about your recovery and your work as a nurse, it's made me realize I've been part of the problem instead of part of the solution." As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, Captain Torres's voice came over the intercom with the usual landing announcements. But when he finished the standard information about local time and weather, he added something unexpected. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for flying with us today. I also want to remind you that every person on this aircraft has a story, has overcome challenges, and deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Sometimes the most extraordinary people are sitting right next to us, and we only discover their strength when we take the time to look beyond our first impressions." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face again, but they were tears of gratitude and amazement. What had started as one of the most humiliating experiences of her recovery had transformed into something beautiful and healing. As the plane touched down at LAX, Mrs. Wellington turned to Sarah one final time. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but would it be possible to get your contact information? I think my son could benefit from talking to someone who's been through what he's going through." Sarah smiled and pulled out a business card from her purse, something she rarely did, but she had brought a few in case her sister wanted to introduce her to friends or colleagues. "I'd be happy to talk with him. And Mrs. Wellington, don't give up on him. Recovery happens when people are ready, but having someone believe in them makes all the difference." As passengers began gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark, Sarah realized that this flight had become a turning point in her life. For 4 years, she had lived in hiding, keeping her story secret, minimizing herself to avoid judgment. But Captain Torres had shown her that her story had power, that her experience could help others, and that she deserved to take up space in the world. When Sarah finally walked off the plane, she saw Emma waiting for her at the gate, jumping up and down with excitement. But instead of rushing directly to her sister, Sarah stopped and turned back to wave at the group of passengers she had just spent 5 hours getting to know in a way none of them had expected. Captain Torres appeared in the cockpit doorway as passengers filed past. When he saw Sarah, he smiled and gave her a thumbs up. She mouthed thank you to him, knowing that no words could adequately express what his intervention had meant to her. As Sarah embraced her sister, Emma pulled back and looked at her with surprise. "You look different," she said. "You look lighter somehow." Sarah laughed, thinking about the long sleeves she had been so determined to wear, and how she had ended up rolling them up willingly for the first time in years. "I think I am lighter. I think I'm ready to stop hiding." That evening, as Sarah and Emma sat on the beach watching the sunset over the Pacific Ocean, Sarah told her sister about the flight. She talked about the humiliation of being judged, but more importantly, she talked about the power of having someone see her true worth and defend it. "The thing is," Sarah reflected, watching the waves crash against the shore, "I spent so long believing that my past defined me, that my scars made me less worthy of respect and dignity. But Captain Torres and his daughter taught me something I had forgotten. These scars are proof that I survived. They're evidence of battles fought and won." Emma reached over and took her sister's hand. "I've been trying to tell you that for years." Sarah squeezed Emma's hand and smiled. "I know, but sometimes you have to hear the truth from a stranger before you can accept it from the people who love you." 3 months later, Sarah received a letter from Mrs. Wellington. Her son had entered treatment and was making progress in his recovery. Robertson had successfully reconnected with his brother, and their relationship was stronger than it had been in years. Jennifer had started volunteering at a local addiction recovery center. But the letter that meant the most to Sarah came from Captain Torres's daughter, Maria. She had heard about the flight from her father and wanted to reach out to Sarah directly. "My dad told me about meeting you," Maria wrote, "and how you helped transform a situation that started with judgment into one of connection and healing. That's exactly what recovery is about, taking our pain and using it to help others. I hope you know that your willingness to share your story made a difference for multiple people that day." Sarah kept all the letters in a box next to her bed, but she no longer hid her scars under long sleeves every day. She had learned that her story, the whole story, including the painful parts, had power. Not power to shame or diminish her, but power to heal, to connect, and to remind others that redemption and transformation were always possible. The flight that had started with judgment and humiliation had become the catalyst for Sarah to step fully into her own life, scars and all. And every day as she worked with trauma patients who were having the worst days of their lives, she carried with her the knowledge that sometimes the most important healing happens not in hiding our wounds, but in allowing others to see them and recognize the strength it took to survive.